First of all, today we have a we have a wonderful guest with us, Arjun Nagarajan. Arjun is one of those very few people who puts out macroeconomic views pretty frequent. I think every day he writes one pager on what is happening in macro, both India and globally. And his is one of the very few write-ups that I look forward to every day and I read. So when I was thinking about all the noise that is going on around us in the world, Trump tariffs to what is happening in India. Yesterday, we saw Prime Minister Modi from the Red Fort talking about GST nationalization, and so many things are going on. So I thought, let me get hold of Arjun to uh, help us understand and navigate this, crazy world of macros. So, you know, the one thing I have always believed personally as an investor is that understanding macros, understanding the global economy, the Indian economy is very, very critical. In spite of what, maybe Buffett or Peter Lynch might have said about macro. But my personal experience has always been that the big risk in the markets, the big moves in the markets happen because of macros. If you look at the dot-com bust, if you look at the global financial crisis, if you look at COVID, none of these were inherently problematic because of individual companies or industries. The problems were macro in nature, it was global in nature, and that is where the real big risk comes from. Even today, whenever we are talking about Trump tariffs, etc., the risks are macro in nature. It is never, or it is very rarely, the big market falls typically happen because of the big macro changes that happen. So today we'll pick Arjun's brains to understand where we are in the world. So Arjun Nagarajan is the chief economist and communications manager, if I'm not wrong,
Yes.
in the Sundaram asset management company, Sundaram Mutual Fund. So Arjun, first of all, thanks for being here. Uh, you know, just maybe spend some time to give us an introduction about yourself, what you do, how did you get here, and let's start with that.
Sure, sure. Thanks a lot, Abhishek. Pleasure to be here and pleasure to interact. And you made a very nice observation about, I think, Charlie Munger and Buffet. Um, I think probably that holds good for a developed economy where inflections are not very frequent, but for an emerging economy like India, where inflections are very important, I think probably the context might be slightly different for India as well. So you might be right in saying that it probably those comments might not pertain to India at this phase of India's growth. As for me, I've sort of accidentally entered this industry. I wanted to stay a mile away from the corporate world. I wanted to get into teaching, so I started off my career. I started off my academics with BCom. I'm a commerce graduate. I did my BCom, and after my BCom, I did an MA in economics. So I landed up with economics because I figured I didn't want to do math. I didn't want to do all of that. So I sort of negated all of the other, and I landed up with economics. I did MA in economics. I loved what I really got into, and then I taught in the same college for a couple of years, 2.5 years. And while I was teaching, I did my MPhil in economics, and then I went abroad to do an MSc in economics in UK, a 1 year course. And when I was doing my MSc in economics, I guess family pressure, they said, no, you have to get married. And I said, hey, if I come to India, what will I do with an economics degree? At least let me do one more degree. And I fortunately got a part scholarship and I did an MSc in finance. I came back to India and I figured that on my resume, everything was economics. Nobody really wanted to hire me for anything finance related. So I landed up with a job in economics. I started my career in MK Global in Bombay for a year and a half as an research as an associate to the banking analyst for a year and a half. Then I switched to Sundaram for around 7 years. I was in Sundaram Mutual Fund. Went back to Bombay again for another Bombay stint for a year and a half. I was in SBI Caps Securities a year and a half. Then back again to Sundaram in 2019. So when I came back to Sundaram, I figured that Sundaram was also trying to shift and try to reach the outreach. They wanted to have a larger outreach, so they wanted to hire me also as the communications manager. And from then on, I said, let me start doing these one pages that I started off earlier. Let me start doing that on a more frequent basis, and that's how the genesis of these one pages started. I made weekly as well from the one pages, because one pager was too frequent for many. So I started doing a two pager or a three pager just for Saturdays and Sundays. So Saturdays were just on domestic macro and Sundays on global macro. Then the last 1 year, after we've had a change in management from Franklin Templeton, Anand Radhakrishnan joined us. So we sort of tweaked it a little bit more, nuanced it a bit more. So we put out two monthlies as well. So one monthly is called Market Insights, first week of the month. That take just one topic that really stood out for us the last month. So this month I've written about Hong Kong and China, how the equity markets have actually picked up there. I think we'll talk about that, because I think that's one very key risk from an India point of view as well. Then we put out.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you've been starting. You've started making videos as well. That also I've seen. That those are also very interesting.
Yes, short YouTube shorts based on the market insight. So in case you are not able to read the monthly or the on a regular basis, you can just get a synopsis of that on the shorts.
Right.
So this is broadly how I started and where we are at this point in time. So I work as the economist. So the aim of these monthlies and weeklies is just to simplify whatever is happening on the global and the domestic front, and say, hey, this is broadly what you really need to know. Everything else, so I'm trying to cut the noise as much as possible and just say, from a macro point of view, this is probably what is there. So if it does not feature in the daily that I write, at least it means that from my point of view, I feel it is not as market important as I think it should be.
Brilliant. So let's start today's discussion with the biggest elephant in the room, the US tariffs, right? So tell us about your thoughts on tariffs, on how it can impact us, how it can impact the US. So we have so many questions, right? We see so many perspectives, in the media from different viewpoints, from the US, from India. Some say that US inflation is going to go up. Some say that it's not going to matter a lot. Some say India is going to get severely impacted. Some say it's not going to matter a lot. So where exactly, maybe just sort of help us understand this.
Fair enough. One thing I'll do here is I will stay away from the numbers, because there are so many numbers doing the rounds with every commentary that the US president actually makes. So I'll give a very broad point of view that I keep telling everyone, is that the markets want certainty. That's all. As long as there is uncertainty, the markets are always worried. So I tell people that on April 2nd, if the US president had come and said, hey, I'm going to put a 70% tariff on every single country for the next 15 years, the markets would have been really upset. But in a month and a half, I think probably within a short period of time, the markets would turn around and say, hey, this is reality. Let's deal with this reality. Let's move on and see how we can make good this impact that's going to hit us. So people would have come out with rate cuts or fiscal supports or changing their export basket, etc., etc. The problem this time around, or rather the problem now, is from April 2nd till now, we are on the 16th of August, there has been so much that has changed on the tariffs. Nobody with certainty can tell you anything on tariffs. So it is the uncertainty around the tariffs that one day it is 10%, one day it's 45, then it goes to 20. Then you think a deal is going to happen and change everything, and then there's an extra 25% that starts coming on. So there's so much that nobody seems to have. So from an entrepreneur's point of view, if I wanted to establish, let's say, a manufacturing unit, two things really that bother me. One is commodity prices. So when commodity prices are extremely volatile, you will not really see capex, private capex happening to a large extent. And when the business climate is very, very volatile, especially politics or trade war or geopolitical wars, I think that will also be another event where you will not really see much of capex coming through. So one simple indicator you have in, I think, 2018, when this entire tariff narrative came around, February of 2018, if I recall, when the US president had actually, the current US president, Mr. Trump, had actually put on aluminum and steel tariffs were introduced in 2018 February, you started seeing capex getting hit, and he went behind China, and you saw that entire phase, those 2 to 3 years. So 2018 was the year when global capex was just about to pick up. It didn't happen because of tariff uncertainty. It was just starting to happen by end of 2019. The market said, hey, everything is sort of settling down. Probably you might have a change in government, etc. And 2020, you had COVID again coming. So that global capex that was supposed to start didn't happen. COVID then, capex in a different sense sort of happened post-COVID. But then again, when in 2020, the year and 24 start is probably when you actually were expecting this capex narrative to start picking up again. And then you have the tariff narrative from the early of 2025. So it is the uncertainty that I think is the biggest problem that markets have, not exactly the specific number on the tariff. I'm not saying the specific number on the tariff is not a problem, but it's the certainty that the markets really want to see, whether it is a 50% or whether it is a 25% or a 15%. They want to know what they're going to deal with, at least with a certain amount of certainty for the next 3 to 5 years. So from a tariff point of view, India is in a very sticky place where they say between the devil and the deep blue sea, something similar, where there are three points where the US is trying to push on. They want access to our dairy, they want access to our agri, and something around the Google tax as well, where they want certainty that India will not really reimpose. They want a commitment from India that they won't do that. And the third part is probably a sovereignty issue. I don't think India will say yes. And the first two are very, very political in nature, because anything remotely, if the government moves in that direction, I think it's almost certain that anybody can say what their political fate is going to be. You have very important elections in 2026 and in 2027. You have Bihar and Tamil Nadu in 2026, and you have UP in 2027. So I don't think the government will go anywhere in that direction. A quote comes to mind, a quote that I've really cherished for a very long time. There used to be this, I think he's still there, Juncker, Jean-Claude Juncker, as a former president of the European Union. So he made a comment a long time ago, I think in early 2000s. He said, see, as politicians, we exactly know what the right option is. We know exactly what to do. But what we don't know is doing the right thing and coming back to power. That is the biggest problem with politics as such, because the best thing that the country needs at any point in time will create a certain amount of pain. It will be good for the longer term for the country, but in the near term, if you execute it in entirety, then there's a very likely possibility that you might not come to power. So it's a very, very fine trade-off. So in that trade-off, I think the current government or current dispensation seems to understand where that equation lies, which is possibly the reason why you are seeing a fair bit of a diversification from a diplomatic standpoint as well. We've gone to China. I think there are at least a couple of narratives that have come through is China sort of easing its exports of urea to India. China and India, on the air route front, there seems to be a fair bit of easing. So how much of this is going to translate into trade and how much of that is going to open up, that's something that we have to see. But from a trade point of view, I think certainty is the most important. So until that certainty sets in, private capex as a broad narrative, I think will see a fair bit of a lag. So from a GDP point of view, if I can break it down into four drivers, you have private consumption, you have investment, you have government spending, and you have net exports. So whenever you have a significant amount of trade related uncertainties, global growth related uncertainties, you are unlikely to see net exports and private investment see they're unlikely to be very large delta drivers of GDP. I'm not saying they will not grow. For example, in investment, all those policy push areas will see some sort of a positive momentum. But on the whole, if I look at the broad momentum, the exports momentum and the private investment momentum will see some drop in momentum, or rather the extra delta might not really come from there. Then we land up with just two more, which is government consumption and private consumption. Now, government spending, I can break it down into two: your central government spending, state government spending. Um, for a central government or a state government, the spending, you can break it down again into two: revenue spending and capex spending. This is a number that I think one should remember. You have a lot of academic studies that tell you that if you spend 1 rupee, if a government spends 1 rupee on revenue expenditure, the multiplier is 1 or less than 1, largely less than 1, which in short, it means that if I spend 1 rupee on revenue expenditure, largely salaries, interest payments, and all of that, the addition to GDP is less than 1 rupee.
So there's no multiplier affecting us.
Yes, exactly. So the multiplier is less than 1. But if I look at the multiplier for capex, it is anywhere between 4 to 6. Let's take the lower end, which is 4, which means every rupee that I spend on capex, over a period of time, it adds nearly 4 rupees to GDP. So the quality of spending is something that is very important. Now, central government spending, I think since 2014, the current political dispensation, 80% of the time, you've always seen more capex rather than less capex. And they have rarely, it's not that they have not done, but whenever there is pressure on the fiscal, the last option that the current dispensation does is to dip into the capex. If I look at history from 2000 or so, most of the time, whenever there's fiscal pressure, it is the capex target that is compromised. This time around, that doesn't, at least 80% of the time, that has not happened. 20% of the time, that has happened. But if I look at it probability-wise, there's a very much higher probability that they will not dip into capex from a central government point of view. Now, if I look at state governments, the last couple of years, state governments, elections is the main reason probably. Nearly 2.5-3 lakh crores has been spent just on freebies. Once that momentum starts, it's very difficult for that momentum to drop. You have 3 very important states coming in 2026 and 27 for elections. So my hunch would be that this momentum on the state freebies spending is not really going to see a die down soon, which then means that the quality of state government spending will definitely be lower than what probably it has been in the past, purely because of the political pressures that you will be seeing.
So, just hold your thought on that, maybe.
Yes.
So I have this question around freebies. So I'm not getting into whether it is right or wrong, or whether, it is social spending by another name. But from what you just said, essentially, freebies is basically just revenue expenditure where the multiplier effect is less, if I want to understand it that way.
Yes.
Right. So I'm just giving money to somebody, and the multiplier effect is lesser than if I had sort of maybe built rural roads, or water, or whatever. I mean, whatever else, schools, etc., right?
Yes.
So essentially, the multiplier effect is lesser when I'm spending on just giving handouts or giving money to people.
Correct. So this is a generalization. I agree in the sense that freebies, there are more responsible freebies also to a certain extent. So something in the in the range of something towards education. For example, there have been states where they have given bicycles to children to actually go to schools. So these, in the overall scheme of things, the amount of money spent on these are much lesser. But you can sort of segregate these also and say that, hey, these, though they call them freebies, may not exactly be freebies, because in the longer run they help towards something. But on the whole, I think it would be a fair generalization to make that most of them will categorize as revenue spending.
Okay.
So for a state government to sort of increase that spending on freebies, either their revenue expenditures, rather their incomes have to go up, revenues have to go up quite substantially. If the probability of incomes going up quite substantially at this point in time, where India is and where global growth is, seems very unlikely, which then means that the only option for them is to dip into the capex that they had already allocated in their earlier budgets. So for drivers of GDP, net exports and investment, we said, see, there's definitely going to be a loss of momentum there. Rather, extra oomph might not come from there. Then comes central government spending and state government spending. State government spending, I feel the quality of spending might see a compromise in the next couple of the next couple of years. Central government spending, I don't think there will be a compromise on the capex quality, on the spending quality, given the data that we've seen so far. Then we'll land up with the last item, which is private consumption. Now, private consumption, if you look at visibility of all these four drivers, there seems to be much more visibility for private consumption to give you that extra oomph from a GDP point of view for India for the next few years. So there are nearly some 7-8 drivers of private consumption. So if I list them out, let's say the top two that come to my mind is your tax cuts and rate cuts. Now, your tax cuts and rate cuts, whenever they happen, you always have seen urban consumption start picking up, because your disposable income increases when your tax cuts happen. When your rate cuts happen, also you see a fair bit of a pickup in disposable income. So that is one. Then is actually crude. So there's been so much of that has been happening on crude prices. We don't realize that from the start of 2025, where crude was nearly $82, $83 a barrel, we're now at 65. So loosely, somewhere just under $20 a barrel is how crude has actually come off. And unless there is anything significant geopolitically that is disrupting crude supply, crude prices are unlikely to move much higher from this 65-70 band in the near term. If I make that safe assumption that for the rest of for at least another year, we might not see geopolitical disturbances, which then means that the 65 or a $15 or a $18 drop in crude prices will definitely be positive for India on the sidelines. So we'd written about, let me see, can I share the screen? Okay, just give me a second.
Sure.
We'd written about this in, I think, February. Let me see if I can just access that on the internet. It's a very telling table. I think I can get it here. It's okay if I share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a second. Okay, you can see my screen here. Yeah, so the table on the left is probably what I'm talking about. So I'm just giving an example of 2014 to 2016, when crude prices nearly came down $80 a barrel. What really happened? All of these variables see a fair bit of a drop. Now, I know it's not exactly $80 a barrel. It's probably $20 a barrel, if at all the best case scenario, which is still 25% of that drop that you saw earlier. So first thing that happens, you see crude imports coming off. Then you see inflation coming off. You see WPI inflation coming off. And these two, especially the input WPI inflation, is extremely important for one item, which is your gross margins here. So for all of those who, I think all of you track markets very closely, if I look at the BSE 200 gross margins, In the 2014 to 16 phase, you saw gross margins of BSE 200 increase by 8.5%. Now, if I just do a pro rata, I know it's not the best way of looking at it, but even if I do a pro rata for a $20, probably it will be half of this, no, 25% of this, which will be, let's say, 2.5%. I'm just giving just drawing a number out of my hat just to bring the importance of that. And then you see there's much more room for the RBI to cut rates. So from where we are currently, I think another 25 basis points of rate cuts, I think from an RBI point of view, is very likely. It's only a question of timing. So I use, for example, when if you track companies, what the management says is very important for all of you.
Correct.
So for me, what the governor says is very important. So the governor does not tell you where exactly it will be, but they give you a broad framework. So they give a very clear framework even before markets ever thought inflation will come down. In an interview, he made a mention saying, "Hey, if inflation comes down below what we think, there is space for us to cut." He did come, he cut, and then he again came out and said, "See, inflation has come down. I think it's going to come down even more." But he added one more variable. He said, "If growth also comes below our forecast." Now, they came from 3.7 to, I think, 60 basis points. They came lower from their inflation target. Growth, they still hold it at 6.5%. Now, with all of this tariff narrative, I think it is more realistic to look at GDP growth for FY26 somewhere closer to, I think, 6 to 6.2%. I think that's more realistic. I would think closer to 6%, but then let's say have a little more positive view there, assuming something turns there. But nevertheless, in and around 6% is what growth is going to be. So it's just a matter of time when I think the RBI also brings down their GDP forecast. And as and when they do, I think the 25 also opens up. Now, why am I saying all of that? Because if I recall, 2015, the 2014 is when prices of crude came off, and which is why this happened. RBI was cutting rates when the Federal Reserve in 2015 started increasing its rates. So we had nothing to do with the global Federal Reserve's rate cycle. Why were we able to do something completely independent? Only because crude prices came off. So I keep telling people that there is one variable that can really turn in our favor and completely change the whole landscape for India in a very positive sense. It's crude. So it has come down to a decent extent to around $65. I don't really think lower than 65 is a realistic possibility. But nevertheless, I think last week, I think IEA had put out a number saying, hey, even a $50 a barrel is something that we are looking out for. I think their short-term forecast, there was some commentary around that. But nevertheless, I think that is one variable one has to very closely keep an ear out for if there is a drop in crude. Yeah.
So one question here is, like you mentioned, the crude fell between 2014 to 16, and similarly, we've also seen crude falling in the last couple of years, right? So the changes or the positive impact is already in what we are seeing today, or do you see that so assuming that the current price of crude, which is 60, 65, 70, it holds in that region, or is the impact going to be, does the impact get delayed and comes in after a year and a half? So my point is that the change that we are seeing, is it already, in the price, is it already happening, or is it going, because we are already seeing inflation down significantly, right?
Correct.
Or is it something that is yet to play out fully?
I think part of it is there. I can't probably, if I were to put a number, maybe I'd say 30-40% of it maybe probably priced in. WPI is now in negative territory. It's at minus 0.6, I think, was the last number.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It moved down from minus 0.3. Whenever your WPI goes down, immediately I think the trigger that goes in my mind is, hey, raw material prices are actually going to start coming off. Then it becomes very sector specific. So one number that I can immediately that comes up to my mind is the directly linked with crude is whenever your crude prices come down, raw material prices come down for that FMCG segment that comes down. Because I remember a very interesting data that I came across around three years ago. Your packaging material prices are directly linked with where crude prices are, at least fair directionally. I think it is HTPE and all of them that actually
Correct.
going, which is roughly around 25-30% of your raw material cost for FMCG companies. So this is just one sector that I'm just sort of touching upon. But like this, you have across the board sectors where you will start seeing some positive trickle down if WPI also sort of stays low. So there are two sides to this coin. On the one side is when WPI starts coming down and input prices start coming down, gross margin expansion to some extent starts happening to a decent degree. But then your nominal earnings growth numbers also. So for example, if your CPI is also low and your WPI is also low, your deflator in the GDP is something like an average between your CPI and your WPI, which means that if your GDP growth is real GDP growth is 6%, and let's say inflation is around 4.5%, 10.5% is your nominal GDP growth. If this 4.5 starts shrinking to, let's say, 3.5, 4, it means even your nominal GDP number has to see some sort of a tweak lower. So there is the other side to this coin as well. But the positive again is that on the government finances front, you have seen that whenever you see a drop in crude prices, this political dispensation, they are very clear. They do not pass it on to lower crude petrol and diesel prices. They increase excise duty. That hasn't happened so far, I think, but since start of 2025, I think that seems a logical possibility. And whenever they've done that, you've actually seen your excise duty as a percentage of GDP start going up. Your fiscal deficit starts coming down to some extent, and whenever they can, that extra money that they generate, they use it to perk up the capex number to some extent, is what they've done the last cycle. So from a consumption point of view, that one variable I think that is very important, I think, is crude prices. So I go back to again those 4 pointers that I was talking about. Tax cuts, rate cuts will be very positive for urban consumption. Crude, I think, is this third variable that I think you have to very closely watch out for. Any additional weakness there, I think you should very closely look at it sector-wise and see where there can be a benefit. The last point, apart from the disposable income that you will get from lower inflation, all of that, is from a urban point of view, monsoons are doing fairly well. I think that is a good positive. Your real rural wage growth is also picking up. But the most important structurally for the next 3 years, let's say 2026 to 2029, will actually be the pay commission. Now,
Correct.
the 7th pay commission saw a significant boost in the economy, mainly because of 3 reasons. One, you saw a fair bit of inflation between 2005 to 2015. 2015 to 2025, those 10 years, inflation was not as much. Remember that the GFC, the fiscal stimulus that followed the GFC, was covered in the 7th pay commission, the increase in inflation.
Correct.
That amount of inflation did not happen in the last 10 years. So from an inflation point of view, from an inflation compensation point of view, the 8th pay commission increase may be much more muted or much more realistic than what you saw in the 7th pay commission. The second thing that happened for the 7th pay commission was the delay in the disbursal of the money, which means in addition to the fact that they got a very big jump up because of inflation, you also had an arrear, a fair bit of a chunky arrear that came in. So there was actually, though it is effectively the same money that had to come through, but from a nominal point of view, they get this money also. They get the arrear also in a chunk, which gave a fair bit of a push to the small cost segment and discretionary consumption as well. So I think one way you look at it is, if I am assuming that there is not going to be an arrear this time around, it's not going to be a very delayed arrear, probably by end of 2026, the payouts will start. Now, we don't really know because even the committee, I think they've not even still announced the members in there. So let's say even start of 2027 if the payouts start, which means 27, 28, 29, a 3-year period, I think there's going to be a decent support for consumption from an economy point of view. Now, why 3 years? First, you have roughly around 12 million people who are covered under the Central Pay Commission. Central government employees are roughly around 12 million. Employees plus pensioners is what I'm adding here. So employees plus pensioners, roughly around 12 million. When the Central Government Pay Commission happens, soon enough, you also have the pay commission for the PSU companies coming through. PSU employees are roughly around 1.5 million or so. Then you have the states implementing the state pay commission. State employees are slightly larger than central government, around 12.5 million or so. So you take a 12 plus a 12.5 plus a 1.5, roughly in and around 25 million government employees are going to get a decent pickup in their pay scale over, let's say, a 3-year period. Which means from a consumption point of view, I think there's going to be decent support. Now, how much of this consumption is going to be low-level consumption? How much of it is going to spill into, in a big way, into discretionary consumption? That will depend on two things. One is the extent of the hike that you get in the 8th pay commission, plus also if there is any delay or an arrear, a chunky arrear like you had the last time around. If that does happen, then that's possibly another positive. Now, what we don't really know is, always remember there is also a political angle in here. You have 3 state elections coming. Do they want to give the payout end of 2026 start, or do they want to push it a little earlier? Because if it starts end of 2026, it will actually be a very early payout, because on average, you see 1.5 to 2 years has generally been the gap between the commission and the payout. Roughly, that is a time frame. So if you think that the current political dispensation is not going to be any different, then they might also want to time it closer to some state elections that they think are important, which then sort of delays it. But nevertheless, from a structural support point of view, I think this is definitely there from a consumption standpoint. So visibility, I think there's a fair bit of visibility for consumption for India over the next few years. That's fairly clear. One last point I'll talk about. I think I've been talking about this consumption point for too long. One last point is the rate transmission this time around is likely to be much better than the rate transmission that we saw in the last few years. Now, why is that? I'll give you just 2 numbers. If you look at the central, the SCBs, the scheduled commercial banks, if you look at their loan book, around 20-25% of the loan book are fixed rate loans. The rest of them are floating rate loans. Now, the fixed rate loans, let's take them out because we're not dealing with that. Because whether the RBI raises rates or cuts rates, it's not really going to have an impact there. The floating rate loans is going to have an impact. The RBI's goal has been for many years now is to trying to see if they can push the banks to do more rate transmission. Base rate came in, MCLR came in. It was not as successful as probably they wanted it to be. And then they introduced something called the EBLR in 2019, the external benchmark lending rate, which is either largely linked to the repo, but also T-bills. So T-bills and repo roughly, let's look at them as synonymous. So if I look at the floating rate loan book, less than 3% of the floating rate loan books in 2019 were under the EBLR system, which means directly linked to the repo. As of March 2025, 62% of the floating rate loan book comes under the EBLR segment, which means that whenever the RBI cuts rates this time around, transmission is going to be much higher because 62% of the floating rate loans are under EBLR compared to under 3%, which was in 2019. So rate transmission is going to be much better this time around because transparency for the EBLR rate regime is almost 100%. There is nothing there's no formula that you can can look a little vague, etc. It's just directly linked to this external benchmark. So which when rate cycle turns around, that is also something to think of. But at least where we are now, the current rate cycle that you're experiencing, I think you will see better transmission on the ground, and which means, for the lack of a better word, I think more hands, your EMIs will come down or get readjusted at a much faster pace than it ever did in the previous few cycles. So that will also be, from a consumption point of view, a fair bit of a visibility positive, or support from a consumption point of view.
So the other part is the tax breaks, right? So we've already last budget we saw some tax breaks coming in. Now, see, the other question that I have is, in this kind of a geopolitically uncertain environment that initially we started talking about, especially with tariffs, US, whatnot, the government definitely may need to step in into some of these sectors where there are challenges in exports. So typically maybe textiles, gems, jewelry, etc. Right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
some kind of support might be required. Now, like you mentioned, the government also has constraints in resources, right? It's the money that they are earning per se is not infinite, right? So they will have to do their balancing act. So essentially, help us understand what can happen from an individual's perspective, as well as how do we look at it as an investor. So are in are taxes likely to go up? Is capital gain taxes likely to go up, down, whatnot? I mean, what could be the possibilities?
Very, very, very fair question. So the only thing that comes to my mind is that famous saying where they say the only certainty is life is taxes and death. So every government, I think, they will always lean into taxes. The only question is, how much are they leaning into taxes and what type of taxes? For example, that GST reform that is expected probably around Diwali is. They're talking about this rationalization where they're bringing the existing 12% and 28% slabs there to be discontinued. So you'll have the 5% and the 18%, and then I think there is this talk of I think around the 40%.
40%, yeah.
40% or so. The point here, I think, is that under that 18% slab, 70 to 75% comes under the 18% slab. So there is a fair bit of an argument to be made that, see, they're using indirect tax, they're readjusting it in such a way where it can also become a consumption boost, where all those that are under 28, if it actually collapses under the 18, you're freeing up that 10%. So from a consumption point of view, that is a possibility. But let me put it this way. This government from 2014, rightly so, has been focusing on fiscal consolidation. Now, fiscal consolidation is a positive from the point of view of increasing credibility from a rating agency point of view. Now, from triple B minus, we are now at triple B. But triple B, it is still, maybe you can say it was one notch above junk. Now you can say it is two notches above junk, if at all you can use that phrase. But moving into that A category, or let's say double A minus, probably would have probably been something like a real upgrade. This is a tweak per se. Now it gives like a pat on the back for the government that has been doing fiscal consolidation for a while now. So anybody who was thinking that maybe they might want to loosen their fiscal strings, I don't think that's a likely possibility, especially given that they've gotten this pat on the back from ratings. So I don't think it was there on their mind anyway. But even those who think that maybe they might want to think of this, I don't think they will do it after this upgrade from S&P. So then you are stuck with only two things. If they will give support to these sectors that are probably going to get hit from this trade war narrative, the support was going to be very, very targeted, like it was in COVID.
Yeah.
I would want to think that rather than leaning more on the fiscal front, I think they might want to do like they did the last time around under COVID through the central bank, where there was more liquidity and directed liquidity and bank guarantees and things like that. I think that
interest moratoriums, etc.
Yes. So that leverage room is much higher for the same amount of money that, for example, the fiscal cost is X, but with the same fiscal cost, the number of people you're able to touch are much more. So I would think that they will lean more on the monetary side of things to give support to these sectors rather than on the fiscal side. This is not to say that the fiscal side will not be, they will not lean to the fiscal side. I'm not saying that. I think they will. But I don't think anybody can have a guess as to how they can sort of lean into that fiscal side. Apart from the only thing that, from a market's point of view, the only thing we think of is, hey, what about LTCG? What about STCG? That's the first thing that actually comes to our mind. But
What
apart
about
from that,
SPT?
so those are all aspects, and we also know how generally governments think of monies that are made from equity markets. The view that the governments have on equity markets and the gains from equity markets have become more nuanced over a period of time. What they were 15 years ago, 20 years ago, how they looked at markets, I think it is safe to assume that they don't look at markets as crudely as they did then. I think that nuanced understanding has come in a fair bit, especially at least over the last 10 years. You've seen a fair bit of an understanding there. So I wouldn't want to think, for the lack of a better word, killing the golden goose. I don't think they might want to do that, and I think they understand the importance of not doing that. So I would, if I had to hazard a guess, I would guess that I don't think we will see any negative surprises on that front, at least from an equity market point of view. Excise duty hikes are something I think that is coming. What can greatly help the government at this point in time, it's not in our control though, is if crude comes off. Because if crude comes off, excise duty hikes will definitely be much sharper than one probably can think, and that will give a fair bit of a room also for them to spend. The last couple of months, we have seen a loss in momentum on the direct taxes front. So, which means that you will see some measures from the government on the GST front, but it's probably that rationalization maybe is also to see that if they cut the taxes and make it a little simpler, is consumption going to see a pickup? So collecting that 75% of your GST coming from 18%, maybe the share will start rising because consumption sees a pickup around the festive. So this festive, I think, is going to be like a litmus test as to see if that momentum on the economy front is seeing some sort of a pickup. So long story short, I think the leaning will be more monetary in nature rather than fiscal, given that their hands are tied with this fiscal deficit consolidation phase that they're at. Having said all of that, we have to understand that there's only so much the central government can do, because if you target a lower fiscal deficit and you want to keep rates under check and you want to give more room for sustainably keeping rates lower, it has an impact on the economy in the sense that one could argue that at this phase of India's growth, one should not really be focusing too much on the fiscal deficit, because the lower and lower your fiscal deficit goes, that much of stimulus for the economy is not there. Which is probably the reason why the last budget you said, hey, they're not going to go it below this. They're going to shift from fiscal deficit to as a percentage of GDP. So probably it might stay at that 4.5% of GDP handle here on, which means that the increase in, let's say, a capex or expenditure growth will then directly depend on the amount of nominal GDP you're able to bring in. I think I've given a much longer answer. Sorry.
Right, right. Good. The other, important thing that I was, that's sort of going on in my mind and slightly taking you away from only India is with all these tariffs happening, right? In the US, uh, the predominant thought there is that inflation is going to rise in the US, and if inflation rises significantly, US growth will maybe get hampered. US can get into a recessionary kind of a mode, etc. So I'm now talking purely from a Indian markets perspective. So what could be the possibility of impact in the Indian markets or the global markets if US starts seeing a slow, first of all, is there a possibility that US starts seeing significant slowdown? And second is, what happens to global markets, to Indian markets, if in case this kind of a scenario does play out?
Okay, fair enough. So um, let me put it this way. I'll address the tariff part first. So one thing that we've been writing in our daily is saying that, see, from the day this entire tariff narrative started, we were saying, see, we don't really think there's going to be a tariff shock in the US because of that inflation, because of it trickling down to inflation. So we go back to, let's say, 2018. If you recall 2018, I know the 2018 is not a like to like comparison because the tariffs are much lesser at that point in time. It was only China that was targeted. It was not much there. Only the steel and aluminium was a little more broad based. But at the same fear was there in the markets even in 2018 that US inflation was going to go up. US inflation actually came down. So if I actually look at China's export market share in 2018, it was around 3.8% was China's export market share in 2018. Despite all of the tariffs that China had, in 2019, their export market share came down 10 basis points from 3.8 to 3.7. And then a year after that, or 2 years after that, it went up to 4%. So two things that really helped China. One, they depreciated their yuan by 10%. So there was a currency depreciation that happened. But the most important is nearly 90% of the tariff cost for Chinese companies. The Chinese companies absorbed it on their margins. They took a hit on their margins, and they also had state support probably, but they took a fair bit of a hit on their margins, and they saw to it that the prices didn't really change. The government helped them with that 10% depreciation. So net, the US consumer actually did not pay more because of the tariffs on China, despite the fact that they were not importing any different. China started, instead of directly sending it to the US, it went out through Asia, it went out through Mexico, and still went back to the US, despite which you didn't really have any tariff increase. So my limited point is that the US is the largest consumer. 3.3 billion is what it's importing. Every country will see to it, at least this was our view in April, saying that, see, every country will see to it that their export market share to the US is not really impacted, which means they would do what it takes to see to it that prices also don't really go overboard. So US tariffs actually pushing US inflation was not our base case at that point in time. And I think it's still not our base case, which is also the reason why we feel it is very unlikely that US might go into a recession. Now, having said all of that, the politics becomes very important. The US president was nominated in 2000. We are in 2025. Yeah, 2024 is when he came in. 2026 of November is when the midterm elections start.
Right.
The Republicans cannot afford. If we saw the big beautiful bill that was actually passed, you saw a fair bit of a disagreement within the Republicans. So much so that, if I recall, I think the bill was passed with a two member
Correct.
majority. So very sliver of a majority, which is actually telling you a lot, saying that, hey, the US president is possibly on thin ice if this tariff narrative continues for a fair bit of time. Now, here's how I'm looking at it. If by November of this year, I think the tariff narrative has to start dying down. If it doesn't die down, it will start affecting your US macro numbers that have not really taken a hit so far. Your unemployment numbers, a year down the line, let's say in November of 2026, 1 year down the line, it will see some sort of an impact. And there is a realistic probability that the numbers might not look great before the midterm elections if the US tariffs don't really, or rather the tariff narrative does not subside, or there's no certainty around that. Now, there is one workaround here, and that's probably, my guess is that he is trying to push this workaround. Mr. Trump is trying to push the Federal Reserve to cut rates.
It's, yeah.
only option I can see where even after November of 2025, the US president can continue his tariff narrative and not do much about it if he's able to really push the central bank to cut rates and cut rates by a sizable margin. If that happens, immediately the first sector that comes up in the US will be housing, and housing and the link, the positive multiplier that it has in the US economy is fairly good, which means if he's able to, let's say, for example, according to the US president's commentary over the last few weeks, he's been talking about a 2 to 3% cut in the Federal Reserve. We are at 5.5%, no, 4.5% in the US. 2 to 3% probably is an exaggeration, but nevertheless, even if so, the next week I think is going to be important. 22nd, 23rd, you have the Federal Reserve, the Jackson Hole conference coming up, and that is where you will see all central bankers coming, and that's generally a podium where the Federal Reserve comes out and gives a directional call on rates, saying, hey, this is how we see things actually playing out. If there is incremental dovishness that comes from the Fed and an indication that we are going to cut rates much faster than what markets are pricing in, then I think the US recession narrative or other macro narrative might not slow down. And that is the hedge that probably the US president is looking at so that he can continue his tariff narrative. So long story short, I think if the Federal Reserve is not going to deliver appreciable rate cuts starting 2025, the tariff narrative has a shorter shelf life than what probably markets think. But if the Federal Reserve is able to deliver cuts and sound more dovish, then the tariff narratives can have a longer shelf life into 2026 as well. Now, coming to India, now we will have an impact. I think that the fact that we always must realize that whether it is financial markets or the macro global economy, they are neck deep in globalization. Though there are these narratives of deglobalization, etc., we are neck deep in globalization. We cannot really unwind. It's like this the story of um, uh, a dog or an animal carved in stone. The minute you see the dog, you can't see the stone. The minute you see the stone, you can't see the dog. So it's very similar to that the situation that we are in globalization. We've already seen it. Once you see it, we can't unsee it. Once you're in globalization, it's almost impossible to deglobalize in a certain sense. Though there may be segments where there is protectionism that is coming in, etc. But on the whole, deglobalization, I don't think is a realistic possibility. So whenever we look at India growth, it must always be in context of global growth. So I keep giving this example. Let's say last year, global growth was 3.3%. India's growth was 6.65%. Before 2008, India's growth was up to 10.5%. But if you look at global growth at that point in time was 4.5-5%. So we always have this 1.8, 2x sort of a multiple, for the lack of a better word, but we are roughly 2x what your global growth is. So if global growth is 3%, we should not have a problem achieving 6. If US goes into a recession, US is one of the largest economies. So whenever we say global growth, effectively we are talking only about two countries here. One is US, one is China.
China.
India is important, but India is not as important as
Correct.
change the direction of global trade. So if US goes into a recession, you will have US growth coming down, which means India growth, by that simple multiple argument, has to see some sort of an impact. And very interestingly, if you plot the Nifty 50 year on year for the last 25 years, and you plot the S&P 500 in the US year on year for the last 25 years, you plot them in a chart in Excel on two different axes. You will be, I was amazed when I did this exercise 3 years ago, and that chart never really leaves my eyes. Whenever US goes up, India goes up. Whenever US comes down, India returns come down. This is the directionality is almost exactly the same. There are phases where there is a period of divergence, but divergence doesn't really stand beyond 3-5 months. I don't think it really stands beyond that 3-month to 5-month window. The returns of India, we are an emerging economy. So if US does 10% over a period of time, we do have a higher beta, but that works on the downside as well. So what I'm trying to say is not just macros, even markets. We are globalized. The directionality, US returns do really matter from a directional point of view for both Indian markets and Indian macros.
Okay, so now let's talk about something completely different. No, we talked about the four levers of GDP. So we spoke about private investment and net exports getting impacted. We also spoke about government spending and private consumption. Now, increasingly, I mean, this is something that sort of keeps me awake at night to an extent. Is what we are seeing in the IT space, especially with more and more AI coming in. Now, why it keeps me awake is my thesis for the last 20 years is a very large part of Indian consumption is was and continues to be driven by people who work in the IT sector, because one, the salaries compared to other sectors in India still is probably at a higher level, so the disposable income is higher, so the actual spill-off effect into consumption, spending, etc., is higher, and that I think is very evident in all sorts of metrics. I mean, whether we see real estate prices in IT hubs like Bangalore, Pune, Hyderabad, Gurgaon, etc. So the question that I'm sort of trying to think through is if there is a significant challenge in uh, IT recruitment, or if there is uh, some kind of retrenchment or layoffs that keeps happening. I mean, we've seen TCS sort of talking about layoffs, which is a rarity. I mean, in the last 20-25 years, I think I can't remember all that. I can't probably remember ever TCS talking about layoffs, right? So if this becomes a phenomenon, and again, these are most of IT companies or management services companies I've seen. They're also trend following in nature, right? So one guy does something, everybody else follows. So then what happens to our consumption, private consumption? So that's the first part. And the other thing that I'm seeing is a rise of the gig economy that is happening, which is creating a lot of employment. May not be the desired kind of employment that we want, but it is creating some form of formal jobs, etc., at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Especially in urban centers. So, what are your thoughts in and around that, and how can they affect the Indian economy in the near or the medium term?
Fair enough. I don't really have a very elaborate answer for this like I did for the others, but let me just take a stab at this. So, um, you are right in the sense that if US growth comes off, so the way I look at IT is very simplistic. One is the US BFSI and the currency. From an equity
Right.
markets point of view, I think these are the two levers that I look at.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
the minute US BFSI sees some sort of an impact, you will start seeing IT also taking some sort of a shock of that. Now, there's this third element that has come in, which is AI. Now, I genuinely don't really understand it as much as probably I should. The example that immediately always comes to my mind is all those lift operators that were there at one point in time. And the fact that they say the lift there really didn't take anybody's job. It didn't really. I know it's not a exact like to like comparison, but I think we are still trying to understand um, what AI is and how things can really change on the um, productivity front for the formal segment, especially people like you and me. We can see a fair bit of a difference because we can do PPTs much faster. There are so many things that we can.
Right.
Um, I would assume that AI is getting better, and in the sense it's trying to make itself better. Or I'll just give you one small example. I still think that it can't replace the human, at least at this point in time, because let's say if I use Chat GPT or I use Copilot and ask it a set of questions. I did this exercise a month ago, where one of these search engines, I asked them a question, it gave me a set of answers. I said, hey, can you just recheck your answer again? The answers were different, the answers were tweaked, and I did this exercise nearly 9 times, and up to 9 times, beyond nine I didn't try. Beyond nine, after 9 times, it still had errors that it was correcting
Correct.
even after the ninth time. And after that, I said, hey, I'll just use this for giving me links rather than relying on the information, to the extent that sometimes I learn from some of the people in the industry that this is a term they call hallucination, in the sense that it makes up numbers, it makes up projections that are not there in any of the sources.
Correct.
One way of looking at it is that this will sort itself. It is something that it will get corrected over time. I don't know. But the frequency with which I was using these search engines, or these AI based engines, I've started reducing that over a period of time, because I realize the accuracy is really taking a hit, and I don't know. It becomes a little much more unreliable the minute it lodges in my head that, hey, this is what is happening. Then probably I'll be a little more careful. So I think that's the only answer I can directly sort of give you as to whether this is going to have an impact. But one other aspect is that during COVID, the employment that this sector did, the number of people that were added on in this IT as a segment were much higher than what would have been on a steady state basis. There was probably also, I don't know whether, for the lack of a better word, I would guess there was also a certain layer of over hiring in a certain sense, because they
Correct.
assumed that demand would be, there was a linear projection of demand, and on the basis of that. So I would want to think that maybe it is that fluff, or the excess, that probably is getting a little streamlined, given that the tariff narrative, I wouldn't want to think it is a coincidence that it has come, all of this has happened after February, April of this year, where there's a little more uncertainty around global growth. So when people trim their forecasts, they say, hey, maybe this amount of demand is not justifiable if I look at the workforce here. I would want to think of this more of a trimming of sorts, when visibility into the next 1 year to 1.5 years seems a little limited, and and that sort of forces them to revise their demand forecast or growth forecast. I would want to link it more to that than to AI, at least at this point in time, given that it's very, very, very
Fair,
limited
fair enough.
information we have.
Fair enough.
I would probably want to limit it to that. Your second question, I missed it. Sorry.
Second part was more of the job generation by these gig economy at the bottom of the pyramid, and how sort of it can impact us.
That is a point of concern. So, for example, I think last month, we are in August. So I think early August we had employment data that came out, which said that youth unemployment in India was touching closer to around the 15%. And I think this was a year and a half ago. I think it was IGIDR, or one of the research institutes, had done a study on the employment and the earning capacity of all of these food delivery guys, where they were actually doing a fair bit of a detailed study on the incomes that they were earning. It looked like they were earning a decent amount, but their costs were also fairly high, which means net the margin, or rather the amount of money they were making, was fairly a sliver in a certain sense. And there were a lot of views at that point in time that actually said that people were resorting to these food delivery options, these sort of jobs, not because one was the flexibility, but also because there weren't as many avenues out there as well. India, I think we've seen a peculiar problem, because if you look at how China grew, you had a very, very strong manufacturing base. So to some extent, we've sort of missed the manufacturing bandwagon, missed the manufacturing bus. we've skipped that level and we've gone directly into services. So if you look at India's GDP, 55% of services consumption. You look at China domestic consumption. China domestic consumption is way lower than India domestic consumption. India private consumption is the total share of GDP, I think somewhere around 56, 57% for India. China is just under 40 or so. That is something that China is trying to change because they realize that after GFC, they had a very rude awakening saying that they can't have an only export led sort of a growth, and they wanted to give more focus to domestic drivers as well. That from that point of view, it's a positive for India. But then, nevertheless, the fact that we've not really had a very large manufacturing base is also a point of concern, mainly from the aspect that skilling is something that India has to really invest in. Probably we have another decade to go, because till 2050, 2055, we have that demographic dividend upswing that is going to be there for India. So short answer to your question, I think that is a point of concern. Youth unemployment is in double digits, and that is something that we have to address. Skilling is something that we really need to go on a war footing. This entire demographic dividend, I think that has to come in perspective, is in the sense that most of southern India is growing older at a faster pace. Probably population growth rates have been lower, GDP, per capita GDP has been higher. So they have reached also a certain stage in their economic cycle. But if you look at the northern states, population growths are higher. So the entire demographic dividend that we're talking about comes largely from a few states, which are also politically and economically important for India. So not to sound political, Bihar and UP are going to be the two largest states. So if I look at the average age of India, India on average around 28 years is the average age of India. If I look at for example, if I look at Kerala, a state that I grew up in, the demographic dividend is closed there. So the average age of the population is well north of 32, 33. It's actually going older by the year. The reason why you don't have too much of labor force in Kerala is because the demographic dividend is closed. Population growth rates have come off quite sharply, which is the reason why you see a fair bit of a migrant influx there as well. So the entire migration narrative that you hear in politics basically comes from the economics narrative, in the sense that there's going to be a fair bit of a labor surplus in the northern states and a labor deficit in the southern states. And this is inevitable that this migration starts happening. So
in fact, this is the same situation globally as well. I mean, all migration is because of economics.
Very true, very true. So I just stop with this one bit. So UP and Bihar, if I for a joke rather, I say that if tomorrow UP becomes a separate country, it will be the 5th largest country in the world by population, and
Right.
Bihar will be the 7th largest country in the world by population. You add the population of UP and Bihar, it is the exact size of the United States of America. But tongue in cheek, I sort of joke and say they are better than America from an opportunity point of view, saying that if you look at the average age of America is almost 38 years. The average age of UP and Bihar is 19 years. So if we are able to turn around these two states in let's say the next decade or so, under the next decade, we can reap this demographic dividend to an extent that we have not really ever done before. But if we miss the next 8 to 10 years, then the entire demographic dividend that we talk about will be more of a demographic curse in a certain sense, because the amount of money that central and state governments will have to start spending or paying to support this entire cohort of people will actually be fairly large. So before that entire this decade sort of passes through, I think we will, like the point that you actually mentioned on the skilling front and the employment front, I think that is something that has to be addressed on a war footing. So manufacturing, for the lack of a better word, I think that seems to be the only way out. That that can give you a fair bit of a, rather, infrastructure is one. Infrastructure is a very low hanging fruit where which has a quite a significant multiplier effect on both the economy and also largely on labor as well. I think that seems to be the only way out, at least in the near term, while we also focus on other segments as well, R&D and all of that.
Okay. I think I've kept you long enough. Maybe I'll ask you one or two more, ending questions. One again, which is something that there's a lot of debate on, discussion on from time to time, is about the INR USD rates and what it should be. Should India aim to appreciate, depreciate, or do whatever? So, what are your views on the currency front?
Yeah, it's a favorite topic of mine, but something that not many people want to hear because I don't have very favorable views. Let me give you two numbers here. Uh, the last 30 years, if I look at the fiscal average, so what I'm doing is I'm taking every fiscal year, I'm taking the average currency in that fiscal year, I'm taking the last 30 fiscal years. The average depreciation that the INR has seen in the last 30 years is around 3.44%, let's say 3.5%. But if I take only the last 10 years, or the last 5 years, or the last 15 years, the depreciation is not 3.5%, it is much higher, it is around 4% plus. So for the near term, let's not look at 3.5%, let's look at 4.5%, 4%. So 4% is the depreciation that we have seen in the last few years. The question that I keep asking myself is, has anything changed for this depreciation trajectory to completely change? Now the answer is no. We are a trade deficit country. We import more than what we export. So as long as we remain a net importer, I don't see any shift in this trajectory. But if I look at the services part, let's say we were around invisibles. So your current account deficit in the old system, current account deficit is basically your trade deficit plus your invisibles. Invisibles is your remittances and largely your services exports. So let's keep that equation in mind. Current account deficit is your trade deficit plus your invisibles. Your trade deficit, we know what the numbers are, but that is not really going to change, because whenever you see inflation, you see your trade deficit, you will see some sort of an impact there. The invisibles, every quarter, we were roughly at around 27 billion every quarter, which means that 27 billion has gone up quite substantially post-COVID. So we hit, I think, as high as around a 40 billion or 43 billion or so per quarter post-COVID, and it has sort of come down. So from 27 billion or so, I think it's somewhere averaging around 38 billion, let's say, a quarter. Which means a decent increase of around a 10 billion a quarter, for which means around the 40 billion a year. So you are seeing a fair bit of a positive impact on the currency front. So the depreciation has not turned around, but the pace of depreciation probably might be a little lesser into the years ahead. But nevertheless, I think the depreciation is something that will happen. So maybe from that 4%, we might probably be getting closer to that 3.5%, which is the 30-year average, is what it looks like to me at this point in time. Now the question everybody asks is, we are going to import lesser of crude. EV is going to pick up. Hydrogen is also going to come in. All of that is going to happen. Make in India, Atmanirbhar, all of that. Isn't that going to really change everything? The answer is yes, probably it will change, but it's going to take a fair bit of time for that to actually happen. And even if it does change, at least on the face of it, the pace of depreciation can come down, rather than this entire jingoistic narrative you hear around currency completely starting to turn around and appreciation, etc. In these 30 years, there are only 3 years where the fiscal annual average saw an appreciation 3 years back to back, and all those 3 years were before 2008, where the momentum of FII flows into India were quite substantial. Now, this is the first preface I wanted to give. Now, the second part. Um, Whenever people talk about breaking the back of the dollar and how dollar is going to become completely irrelevant, etc., etc., um, at least I tell them that, see, I can't see that paradigm shift happening. I give them two data points. One, the largest market in the world, commodity market in the world, is crude, and crude is still traded in dollars. There is no shift that is happening there. There are things, say, for example, China is importing LNG in euro over the last few years. But if you look at the size of all of these, they're
That's very small.
very small to really make any dent into this. As long as crude continues to trade in dollars, metals continues to trade in dollars, I can't see any indication of a shift of the dollar breaking. That is one. Second, I give them another data point. I say, see, in the last 25 years, so China, we've been seeing that China from 1980s has been trying very hard to really break out of its pace of growth, and it has done quite substantially. Every large democracy grows at a smaller pace of growth because it is a democracy. China is not a democracy, and that is the reason why it has grown at such a scorching pace, which is every choice has a positive and a negative.
Correct.
So the negative that China has is the fact that it doesn't have a democracy. I think we are good being in a democracy. So if you look at China in this 25 years, China has tried its level best to reduce its dependence on the dollar. So from 1.5 trillion of treasury reserves, it's now at well under 700 billion is what it has now. It's too small for it to really have any impact on US yields at any point in time. So I think that narrative is off. But in these 25 years, China, a country like China that is not democratic, that can really do what it wants if it decides to do it, in these 25 years has moved its total trade away from the dollar, which I'm talking about exports plus imports. Its total trade away from the dollar, it has been able to move only 18% away from the dollar. 18 to 19% away from the dollar. So if a country as large as China with a political setup like China is not able to even move more than 18% away from the dollar, I don't really see how any other country or any other group of countries can make any substantial dent into this entire dollar narrative. Now, so at least that is my view at this point in time, that I don't think the back of the dollar is actually going to be broken. The dollar has its issues, US has its issues. It's trying to address that, which is why Trump, the US president, is doing what he's doing. He's trying to shake things up to an extent where he can weaken the dollar to some extent, but bring back a certain amount of competitiveness, try to reduce the current account deficit, so that gap he can sort of utilize that to do more spending on the fiscal front, etc., etc. Remember that 3.3 trillion is what they import. 10% of the tariff that they put, which roughly gives them $330 billion a year just for the 10%, which means 4 months of their entire fiscal deficit is covered with just that 1%, that 10% tariff that they're putting. The net tariff that they are possibly going to receive in 2025 is much larger than the 10%, which means nearly 6 to 7 months of their fiscal deficit will be taken care of for 2025. So they're doing a lot of things on those fronts. So these are the two aspects that I talk about from a currency point of view. Now, the last example I'll give you, and I'll stop the currency narrative. I tell people that, see, let's say you go to a restaurant, you eat your vada pav or dosa or idli, and you're getting out of the restaurant. The bill is 100 rupees. Now, the owner of the restaurant doesn't really care how you pay that 100 rupees, whether you pay it with money that I've borrowed from my father, money that I've borrowed from a friend or a bank, whether I've stolen that money or whether I've actually borrowed that money. The shopkeeper doesn't care. As long as you have money in your pocket for what you have eaten, you can leave that restaurant. Otherwise, you will land up in the kitchen. So the same thing for a country. A very, very simple example, if I look at it, India is importing 100 rupees every year for its needs. We are a net importer. The net importer is 100 rupees. As long as India has 100 rupees in its pocket to pay for this consumption, whether it is borrowed money, FII, or earned money, FDI, or loaned money, which is ECB borrowings of companies from abroad, or NRI deposits into India. What is financing this 100 rupees? Nobody care. The currency doesn't care, at least for the time being. One can argue that if FDI is a very small component of this 100 rupees that is there in your pocket, the risk of a depreciation is going to go higher because all the other aspects, which is FII, ECB, they can actually leave the country at a faster pace. For example, we saw in October of last year, $11 billion went out of equity markets in one shot in one single month. So
Correct.
that is the risk that is there. But nevertheless, from a currency point of view, you're consuming 100 rupees, you have 100 rupees in your pocket, currency is not going to move as much. The minute this mismatch happens, you will see an impact on the currency. This is a very a practitioner's way of, I think, a very operational way I'm explaining the currency. So, from an India point of view, let's say, yes, India's current account deficit has started coming down from $35, 35 billion a year. It has come closer to, I think, 22, 23 billion, 24 billion. But if I look at India, does India have visibility for even the $24 billion of inflows, net inflows into India? If you ask me the question today, it looks like I can't really see that visibility even today. Now, I said FII in equity, FII in debt, FDI, ECB, NRI. These are five financing flows. There is one more, which is banking capital. I'm not including that in because it's almost impossible to predict how when banking capital money comes in and goes out. It's very, very volatile and has a mind of its own, so they can't really see. NRI deposit momentum in the last few months has not really seen a pickup. It's been weak. ECB flows have been weak. If I look at FDI, the net FDI number is in single digits, is barely seen anything, but it's not negative. If I actually look at the gross FDI number, every single year has gone higher and higher and higher. Then why is the net FDI low? Because there's been so much of a repatriation. People are
Correct.
actually taking the profits out of the country, so the net number is higher. So one hopes that if that repatriation stops, then the net FDI number will start growing higher. But as we speak, that has not really
It's not
changed.
growing. Yeah.
It is still in a single digit number. So of the five financing items, three of them, there is no visibility of strength there. Then we come down to two, which is FII in equity and FDI in equity. FII in debt.
Right.
FII in debt seems very unlikely because the simple example I give is, let's say India, a 10-year yield is at 6.4%. The cost of hedging the Indian currency is 2%. So take off 2% from 6.4, you get 4.4.
You get US debt there.
4.5. So
Exactly.
nobody will ever invest in India because on
Right.
a hedged basis, you're not making any money. So FII investment in debt seems to be a very unlikely possibility. Then we are actually looking at one item here, which is FII in equity. Can $24 billion come from FII in equity for this year? Seems unlikely. So from an operational point of view, I still see that currency risk is very much there.
Very much there.
Because I can't see visibility for this financing of the money that we are actually spending for that dosa of 100 rupees that I have to pay for at the end of the year. I don't have 100 in my pocket as yet, which means the currency has to readjust, is the loose way of looking at it. Now, the theoretical way of looking at it is much more simpler, is India has savings, India has investment. The gap between your savings and investment. So India invests 130 rupees. India has only 100 rupees of saving. This 30 rupees has to come from abroad. So that is your current account deficit, effectively. So your savings and investment gap is theoretically your current account deficit. So structurally, we will have a current account deficit as long as the savings and investment gap is not really closed. But operationally, the simpler way of looking at it is, as long as we don't have enough money in our pocket to pay for what we actually consume, the currency risk is very much
It's
alive.
going to remain. Right. I think, brilliantly explained. Uh, so last question, okay,
Yes.
and a mandatory question from an investor. So given all this, right, given the macro, given global, given India, what are the sectors that you think may do well in India over the next few years, and what are the sectors that may see headwinds?
Okay. So near term, like I said earlier, I think there's visibility for consumption, at least in the near term. In the longer term, I think no-brainer growth stories are always your consumption, your discretionary, your services, your financials, manufacturing in certain pockets and cycles. These are all structural stories for India. They are no-brainers. But from a near-term point of view, there's visibility more for consumption. And when I say consumption, I can say consumption as a whole. It includes everything. It includes discretionary as well. So if your pay commission is going to be a much higher, the lump sum is there, then it spills more into discretionary as well. But within consumption, I can also say services to a large extent. So unfortunately, a lot of people, when we say services, they always think of IT. They don't realize that services as a segment has nearly 17, 18 sectors just within it. Trade, transport, communication, finance, insurance, real estate, hotels. Then you have warehousing. You have so many sectors that come under services. And we know GDP. If you look at break up GDP, 55% of India's GDP is services. More important to actually look at is this private consumption spending of India. How much of that is services and how much of that is goods? Nearly 52% of that is services and the 48% is goods. So we are increasingly a service, we are spending more and more increasingly of that private consumption. We are spending more on services. As
Services.
an economy as an economy,
Mm.
50% is services. And as you become more developed in the nature, for example, you look at United States, UK, around 75-80% of their economy is services. That is one structural way of looking at it. But from a spending point of view, private consumption point of view, we are spending every year more and more on services. So services as a segment is also, I think, apart from consumption per se, services, I think, as a segment also stands out quite clear even in the near term. That seems to be one. Financials, though, it anyway comes through. So in the near term, I think consumption, broad consumption and services consumption are two things that immediately comes to me, at least near term in my head. Financials, I wouldn't really know too much because when rate transmission happens, you will see NIM compression to some extent. Then it will be a very case-to-case basis within private sector banks and public sector banks. How is so public sector banks, I can argue saying that, see, EBLR as a percentage of their floating rate loans, private sector banks, I think, are around 82-83% of their, no, I think 86% of their floating rate loan book is EBLR. Public sector banks is only around 45% is EBLR. It looks like I can say, hey, maybe NIM compression will be lesser for public sector banks. But what really surprised me was that last RBI bulletin, when it came out with weighted average lending rates of public sector banks and private sector banks, you saw a much sharper drop in the weighted average lending rate of public sector banks.
Public sector banks,
Which
right.
sort of maybe gives you a room to think that maybe, hey, they're not the same public sector banks that we knew 10 years ago. They're much more nimble. They're probably moving in a more agile manner, etc. Then the only question then is how much of political interference comes in. Is it comparable? Is much lesser than what it was earlier, but then it becomes a very case-to-case basis. But blanket answer, I think, would still be consumption and services on a broad-based basis.
Brilliant. I think let's we'll close today's conversation. More frequently, so that we keep picking your brains on what's happening globally and what's happening in India. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Abhishek. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I'll just leave just 3 pointers from this entire conversation for all of your viewers. 2 things to keep a very close eye out for. One is crude prices. Second is currency. I think these two are things to very closely keep an eye out for. From a very near-term point of view, something where you have to also watch is China. China macros are doing fairly well. There is no concern around China macros. The only concern that is there is inflation. It is in deflation mode, which means earnings for the equity market is directly linked to inflation. Earnings will see some sort of an impact. So there is increasing focus on China. The last 2 months, May and June, has seen $45 billion move into China in the near term. So there are flows that are coming in. So whatever multiple re-rating that happens in China, if at all it does happen, will probably be flows driven rather than earnings driven. How much of patience they have to wait and see that earnings to turn around is something that you have to question, because once a country is in deflation, it's very difficult to immediately come out. It takes a while. So my hunch would be probably is a 2026 affair, H1 end of H1 affair when China slowly comes out of deflation. Stimulus doesn't seem to be a base case that I think China will do, but you have to closely watch the China narrative, because if China does see a pickup, remember Hong Kong and China are two equity markets that are still below their pre-COVID levels. They are so cheap also from a valuation point of view for a reason. But when that shift happens, the risk from an India point of view is India FII flows. On a relative basis, they'll say, hey, there's much more opportunity.
China is much cheaper. Yeah.
So these are three risks, at least three pointers to watch out for: China, currency, and crude prices.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Opportunity.
Brilliant. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, pleasure. Thank you so much.
So let me start. Okay. So I think we have started recording. So